What we're going to do today is continue on with our look at Chapter 8, Experimental Design. And before we get to that, I just want to remind you, if you haven't already done it this week and you have an innovation or suggestion to make, be sure to check the announcement, check the link, the Qualtrics link for this week's suggestion survey. Generate yourself a random number and let's get some of that feedback going. And if you haven't already, also make sure to vote on last week's suggestions. I'll be announcing the winner on Monday. All right, so Chapter 8, Experimental Design. What we're going to do is just highlight the method section, supplemental information that you have access to help you write your method section. And then we're going to get to what an experiment actually is. Last time we saw the need for an experiment. So today we'll take a look at pretest-posttest designs and the simple pretest design. And in terms of experimental designs where you split up subjects, how do you do that in different ways? We'll take a look at independent group designs and repeated measures designs and match pairs designs. All right, and the advantages and disadvantages of each of those, and that's it. Okay, so just to make you aware, this PDF is now available in Canvas in the resources section for the research paper in the files. So this is your supplemental information. This has all the information that you need that you wouldn't necessarily know. So 191 subjects, 36 males, 155 females, 24.2 years of age, 5.8 is the standard deviation, and all subjects participated in the experiment as part of the P211 class. For the stimulus and apparatus, all the lists were taken from Roediger and McDermott. All the lists were associated with a non-presented word. So again, it just has all these details, 6 lists, 15 words per list, and then where you can find additional information for those PowerPoints. And then in terms of the procedure, subjects were tested either individually in pairs or groups of 3. And additional information, recall confidence rating period was 2 minutes long. And also how you will have to include details for the procedure from your memory of the experiment. For example, how were subject responses recorded. So this will give you all that supplemental information that you probably wouldn't have access to without this. And then also, this is your bare minimum of what needs to go into the method section. So definitely all this information will find its way into your method section somewhere, but also this is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you will have to include details, especially for the procedure, from your memory of the experiment. So it's not all outlined here, especially for the procedure. It's just the details that you might not have been aware of. All right, so that's available on Canvas. Download that to help you write your method section. All right, so back to the question. Violence and aggressive behavior. Violence on TV and aggressive behavior in the real world. What is the relation? Is it that watching violent TV causes aggressive behavior? Is it that aggressive behavior causes watching violent TV? Or is it some third variable, such as parental involvement, that independently causes both of those? So that's a question that psychologists want to answer. They want to know what that relation is. And as soon as you're talking causes, as soon as you're talking causality, you need to do an experiment to get at that causality. So an experiment is research where you manipulate the independent variable, you manipulate the cause, and then you compare the outcomes of that when you measure the dependent variable. So once again, this is where you manipulate what you believe to be the cause. That's the independent variable. And then you see what performance comes out of that manipulation, what performance differences or behavior differences come out, and that is the dependent variable. So importantly here, you want to keep all your other variables constant. One of the key features of experiments is that only the independent variable changes, or only the independent variable is different between groups. You can have multiple independent variables, but those are what are different between the groups, and you want to keep all other variables constant. So that's a part of that direct experimental control, where you control every aspect of the experiment so that you keep everything else constant, so that you have only differences because of the independent variable. And randomization is one of your best tools in order to do this. So randomization, splitting subjects up into random groups, assigning them into into groups based on randomization, random numbers, for example. That is your best way to keep all other variables constant. Another way to keep all other variables constant would be this direct experimental control, where you keep those things constant. So let's take a look at aggressive behavior. Let's say that we wanted to keep the groups equal in terms of what might be causes of aggressive behavior. So all we want to do is make sure that the TV watching is different, and we want to control for all other factors that contribute to aggressive behavior. We have 100 subjects, and we can measure them on those different characteristics. So what are some characteristics of a person that might be associated with aggressive behavior? Or what are some characteristics of the subjects that we might want to make sure is equal in both groups? I'll start off with an obvious one. Would we want to have one group all female, one group all males? That's a big no. No, we would not want to do that. So one thing that we could directly control for would be the gender of our subjects. We could say, all right, half of the males go in this group, half of the males go in this group, half of the females go in the first group, half of the females go in the second group. What other factors might we want to control? Yep. Age. We might want to make sure that the average age in the two groups is the same. Other things.
Maybe not change like how much playtime they get like outside of watching TV. Because if they have like a chance to like run around outside, they may be less aggressive because they get some of that energy out.
Okay, so how much do they play outside? So you can take a look at things like, how much non-screen time do they have? And we'll make sure that both groups are about average on that. We could take into account what's their involvement in organized sports and make sure that both groups have about the same number of subjects that are involved in organized sports. Anything else? Okay, so we'll end it right there. That's all an example of that direct experimental control. What's missing here is that there are always hundreds of variables that could potentially influence the aggressive behavior that we have no way of probably predicting or knowing about. So what about things like whether they own a pet, whether they have a dog or whether they don't own a dog? How about what kind of pet do they own, right? Is it a cat? Is it a goldfish? Is it a dog? How about the number of siblings that they have? How about whether they come from a single parent or two-parent household? How about if they come from a traditional or non-traditional family? How about how they're doing in school? Are they getting A's or are they getting B's or are they getting C's? How about how many sick days they had last year during school? How about whether they take the bus into school or whether they get driven into school? How about whether they had a lot of sleep the night before or they don't have a lot of sleep the night before? How about if they came to the experiment hungry or they didn't come to the experiment hungry? That's just 11 off the top of my head. You could keep going on and on playing this game. You can't measure them all. There's no way you could literally measure them all and then split everybody up along those measurements. That's where randomization comes in. Because what randomization does is it takes a subject and randomly assigns them to the two conditions, which means that all of the tired subjects will randomly, if the subject number is large enough, will randomly be split evenly across the two groups, right? You're literally flipping a coin. And if it lands heads, you're over here. If it lands tails, you're over here. And what that does is it'll split up all of the tired subjects. It'll split up all of the pet owners. It'll split up everybody on all these hidden variables. It will ensure that your groups are about as equal as they could possibly be. And especially for those things that you can't necessarily identify or can't control for. So sometimes you want to have that direct experimental control. Like you'll say, okay, I want the same number of boys in both groups, same number of girls in both groups. But other times you just want to make sure that you go with randomization in order to take care of all those possible hidden factors. All right, so we're going to take a look at the experiment now in practice, or how we might design this. So again, the key here is that we manipulate those independent variables to create different groups. So in the post-test only design, this is the one we're going to start with. That's the simplest design for an experiment. And let's take a look at what that might entail. All right, so you have a whole bunch of participants. And you want to know, does watching violent TV cause aggressive behavior? So the first thing is that watching violent TV is your independent variable, right? We're wondering, does this cause aggressive behavior? So the cause is the independent variable. So now we're going to manipulate the independent variable to create separate groups. So we take our participants, we take our 100 subjects, and we're going to manipulate the independent variable to split them into an experimental group and to split them into a control group. We're going to use randomization in order to do that. So typically, as soon as they show up at the door, we would either generate them a random number, for example, using Excel, and if it came out even, they would go into the experimental group. If it came out odd, they would go into the control group, and that would randomize them across the different groups. One experimental group, one control group. This is where we manipulate the independent variable. And then what we would do is we would measure them on their dependent variable. We would measure them on the aggressive behavior. So that splitting up of them in between the two groups, that is where you manipulate the independent variable, the cause. And then when you measure their behavior, that's where you manipulate the dependent variable, the outcome, the effect of the cause. All right, so in our example here, we had our participants, we have our young children showing up to our lab. And remember that the key here is not the behavior that they did before. So one thing you would not do is ask these children, what kind of TV do you watch? Oh, how many hours of these types of shows do you watch? Oh, you watch 4 hours of violent TV. Oh, you watch 8 hours of violent TV. That's not experimental, because that is up to them. That's up to their outside factors. That's up to their other characteristics. That's not an experiment. An experiment is where we manipulate how much TV they watch, how much violent TV they watch. So through randomization, half of these subjects would be put into the experimental group, where we would make them watch 1 hour of Attack on Titan. Right? We would make them watch 1 hour of this violent TV show. And then the other half would get sent to the control group, and we would make them watch 1 hour of Julie Andrews' The Green Room, right? So a non-violent TV show. And that is what we manipulate, and it's independent, right? So independent variable gets its name from the fact that it is independent of their behaviors. So if this subject over here said, oh, I heard you guys are showing Attack on Titan, can I be in that group? You would say, it's independent of your behavior. Let me flip my coin, let me check my random number generator. Nope, you're going to be watching Julie Andrews' Green Room. So it's independent of what they do, and we manipulate it. So we make them watch 1 hour of violent TV, and the other group watches 1 hour of non-violent TV. And then what we do is we measure them on their violent behavior, and we see if there's any difference between those two. And if there is a difference here in the dependent variable, it could only come from this difference here. Because through randomization, the groups are equal. We didn't care about the baggage that they brought to the table, and through randomization, we made sure that that baggage was equally dispersed. So the only difference here can be the only source of a difference here is the difference here, and that's why we can logically conclude that this difference in watching violent TV caused any differences that we might see in the dependent measure. Does that make sense? So far, so good? All right. So we compare them on the dependent variable. I kind of jumped ahead of myself there, but we compare them on the dependent variable. So after splitting them up into groups, we would then measure their violent behavior. And if you recall previously, we would still use some of those techniques from non-experimental methods like delimiting. And we might say, all right, now everybody has half an hour to go play, and we're just going to count how many times somebody hits somebody else. So we compare those two, and again, any difference here can only come from the difference in what they watched before, because the two groups were randomized so that they're the same. So if they lead to different behaviors, the only difference between the two groups was the TV that they were exposed to. And that's the essence of an experiment. All right, so in research, and this is where the big challenge in research comes, you want to keep all your other variables constant. You want to make sure that the only difference between your two groups is the variable of interest. So we want to make sure that the only difference between our two groups is the amount of violence in their TV program. So once again, we do this through direct experimental control to make sure that the groups are the same, randomization to make sure that the groups are the same, and that is what occurred here, because again, these 50 subjects were basically the same as these 50 subjects over here, so we can't explain this difference with anything else than the difference in violence. On the other hand, if we didn't randomize, and we just said, all right, all the female subjects are going to go here, and all the male subjects are going to go here, then we found a difference. That's known as a confound. That gives you an alternate explanation. It could be that any difference we found here is due to the violent TV, or any difference we found here is due to the difference between female subjects and male subjects. That's a second possibility. So we've opened ourselves up to secondary alternative explanations. We have a confound, and that's again why we want to randomize so that these two groups are the same, and any difference there can only come from a difference in the violence on TV. All right, so that was the post-test only design. Now we're going to take a look at another one, another kind of simple design, which is the pretest post-test design. So in the pretest post-test design, what you do is you basically take the post-test design and you add yourself a pretest, where you measure the groups on the dependent variable before you manipulate your independent variable, and then you measure the outcome of that independent variable. So in this situation here, doing the same experiment, looking at violence on TV, what we would do is, once again, we would randomize these two groups, and then before exposing them to the independent variable, to the differences in TV, and before measuring their outcome on the dependent variable, we would give them a pretest. And the pretest would be there. One of the reasons to have it is just to make sure that the randomization worked, just to make sure that these two groups are actually equal on their level of aggression. And that gives us more confidence that, yes, this is the only factor that could have caused any difference that we see later. So that's the pretest post-test design. And again, just adding that pretest as sort of a double check to make sure that your randomization actually worked, actually took place. And something like this would be an important factor to consider if, for example, your subject numbers were low. So randomization might not be effective enough to make sure that the groups are equal. All right, so those are the two basic designs. And remember, we want to keep all our variables constant through those direct experimental controls or randomization. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little critical thinking exercise, and we're going to take a look at our experiment here. And what I want to know is what other variables in this description were not kept constant that could be an alternative explanation. And basically, what are those confounding variables? So let's take a look at this post-test only design right here. So once again, we take the subjects, randomly split them up, have them watch Attack on Titan for 1 hour, violent TV show, have them watch Julie Andrews' The Green Room, non-violent TV show, and then we measure their difference in violence afterwards. Say we find a difference here. We want to say that it's due to violence versus non-violence, but we have left ourselves open because we have at least a couple of confounding variables here. So let's give it a shot. What is an alternative explanation? So if this group was found to be more violent than this group, what other than the difference in violence on those TV shows could have been a contributing factor? Yep.
If there's like one especially violent kid that didn't been put into that group, and then when they went to go play for half an hour afterwards, his actions influenced the other kids around him to be more like aggressive.
Okay, so that's definitely a possibility. We, for this, and you do want to be aware of that, for this exercise though, we're going to assume that the randomization worked.
Okay.
And what occurs with those is that reason is one of the reasons why psychologists always want more subjects. So you'll never hear a psychologist basically saying, oh, I got 200 subjects, that's too much, right? They always want more because there's always a possibility that you get that one extreme individual. If you compare that one extreme individual to 5 other individuals, they make a big difference in the overall measure of behavior. If you compare that one individual to 500 other individuals, they get washed out in a sea of normal people, I guess, would be one way to put it. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider. But let's assume that the randomization worked properly, and both of those groups are exactly the same. What is the difference between those two shows? What was that? This one's nice? That one's not? Okay. Can you elaborate on what you mean by nice? Okay, so one of them doesn't have violence, one of them does. That's exactly what we want, because we're asking, does violence cause aggressive behavior? Are there any other differences? Yep.
One's animated and one's real people.
One's animated and one's real people, right? That's a possible confounding factor. So it might be that it's the actual animated nature of this and the live action nature of this that is causing less violence here and more violence here. So there are theories of identification. There are theories of cartooning that basically say one of the reasons why people like animation, like cartoons, is because it's easier to identify with the characters. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I was drawing a picture of one of you, all right? All right, who did I draw? You have no idea, because this could be any one of you, right? At this level of cartooning, this represents everyone in this classroom. As soon as I add more details, though, some of you are now disqualified, right? This is definitely not some of you. So when you have not as much detail, it's easier for people to identify with the characters. It's easier for people to get involved in the story. And that's one of the reasons, especially children, really like animation. So it could be that this was animated and this was not. So animation leads to violence. Live action leads to not violence. That's a possible explanation. What would we want to do to get rid of that explanation? Exactly. So we would want to get rid of that difference here so that the only difference is violence, and either make this a live action show, choose something like a CSI, type show, or make this an animated show. Choose something like, Trolls, The Beat Goes On or something, right, for that one. So make them both animated. So that's one possible confounding variable. One is animated, one is not. What's another possibility? Anything else come to mind? It's difficult. It isn't easy. Doing an experiment sometimes and finding these differences. Yep. Yeah. Was that a hand going up?
I was
or?
gonna say, what if there's like a show that had like an episode that was kind of violent, and then like an episode that was like kind of soft, so you showed them like the same show.
Okay, that would be one way of taking into account a lot of the other variables that were possibilities. Do you have an idea?
I'm not familiar with this show down here, but
Yeah.
is one educational, one not? Could it just be you gaining?
Okay, so that's a possibility, right? So I'm not very, very familiar with this show, but I have watched the first season of this show, and I gave up on it after like a 5-year hiatus between season 1 and season 2. It was like taking forever. Anyways, it could be that this show is educational and this show is not. So maybe watching an educational piece puts people back into the mindset of being in school, where you're not going to be violent. Maybe watching a non-educational TV show is going to make you violent. So maybe it's the level of education in the TV show. Maybe it has to do with the fact that this one has puppets, right? This one does not. Maybe that's the reason why this led to violence, this led to non-violence. Maybe, just actually kind of looking at this, it has to do with the fact that this features a diverse group of individuals. This show features all Germans, right? So this is one of those weird animes where just about everybody in this show is German. And in fact, if anybody's seen it, there's a plot point about the fact that there's a few Asian people left in this society. Maybe that has to do with it. Diversity leads to non-violence. Non-diversity leads to violence. This is high action. This is not. Maybe high action leads to violence. Low action leads to non-violence. So all of these are potential alternative explanations, right? All of these are potential confounds where instead of being able to say violence causes aggressive behavior, non-violence causes non-aggressive behavior, now we have maybe violence or animation or high action or lack of diversity causes violence, and then the other ones cause non-violence. So that's one of the kind of things to consider when you're designing an experiment. And yours was actually a great suggestion about what to do with this, because you would want to choose conditions here. You would want to manipulate it where it's as similar as possible, and the only difference would be violence versus non-violence. And that was the first time anybody suggested taking 2 episodes from the same TV show, because they're both going to be animated. They're both going to have the same, or they're not going to be animated, right? They're both going to star Julie Andrews. I don't know if she goes off the rails on one of these episodes or anything like that, but that would be a great way to say, all right, highly violent episode, non-highly violent episode, everything else would be the same, give you a much more clear ability to make that final comparison.
You have to use like an older cartoon.
What was that?
Like an older cartoon or like an older show, because I feel like those vary more like.
Yeah.
And stuff.
And you can also, I was thinking more about, I know in anime, there always seems to be that one episode where they go to the beach or they go to the spa, right? And it's like that fan service episode. And there's always nothing really violent happening in that, regardless of what's going on. So, but yeah, I mean, in a lot of TV shows, there's always that one episode that kind of sticks out because it was like uber violent. And then there's the other ones where they kind of mellow it down, and that's just, the kind of narrative arc that a lot of these shows have. I mean, I've never seen Game of Thrones, but I've heard of the Red Wedding, and I would imagine that's probably like the bloodiest of and most violent of that series. Whereas I'm sure at one point people were watching the show and going, this one's kind of mellow. This is more of a let's get to know the characters thing. So that would be a great way to kind of control all those other variables, because that's what you want to do. If you can get rid, or the more variables you can get rid of, the cleaner that deduction that only difference is violence, so that causes any difference we see here. All right, any questions about or comments about the basic idea of experimental design and the need for manipulation of the independent variable to infer that causality? All right. So we're going to end today with a look at experimental designs. And when you do your experiments, there's different ways that you can assign the subjects to your independent variable. And depending upon the nature of your experiment, the nature of what you're looking at, you'll have to decide what is the best way to assign those subjects. So we're going to take a look first at the independent groups design. And this is the one that we actually already took a look at, but let's make it explicit here with the independent groups design. In the independent groups design, this is also known as between subjects design. And what you do is you take your subjects and you split them between your different levels of your variable. So the one that we just saw was an independent groups design, because what we did is we took our participants and we split them into two different groups. We took them and we split them between these two different groups. So what that would look at, if we zoom in here, what that's going to look like is, let's say that we have subjects and they start showing up to our lab. So there's subject number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, and they just start pouring in. And let's say that we end up with 12 subjects that we have for our experiment. In an independent groups design, we're going to take those 12, and through randomization, so we don't give up on randomization, but through randomization, we're going to take some of those and we're going to put them in the experimental group. There they go. And again, these are randomly selected. So we take 6 of them and we put them in the experimental group, and then we take the other 6, and then we take the other 6, and we pop them into the control group. So let's get those guys all lined up. And then the control group gets the other 6 individuals. So this is called the between subjects design because, again, you're splitting up your subjects between the two groups. But this is known as the independent groups design as well, because those two groups, let's line those guys up, those two groups are independent of each other. So the behavior of this individual here, this subject here, has no influence on the behavior of this subject here. Anything that this group does over here has no influence on anything that this group does down here. So if this person is tired, they're not going to make this person tired. If this person is feeling anxious because they forgot their cell phone at home, it's not going to make this person feel anxious. Those two groups are independent of each other. All right, so the other major kind of way of designing is called the repeated measures design. And this is known as a within subjects design. It's also known as a dependent groups design, but we'll use repeated measures design here. And you can, once again, use it with any sort of experimental design. So you could use it with the post-test only design. But we have to show this a little bit more, a little bit differently because of the nature of repeated measures. So this is the way that a repeated measures design works. So you have your participants, and then they experience the experimental condition, and they also experience the control condition. So you would have them in the experimental condition, and then you would measure them, and then you would have them in the control condition, and then you would measure them. And that's your independent variable right there. The difference between the experimental condition and the control condition, that's what you manipulate, that's your independent variable. And your dependent variable comes from your measuring of their behavior after being in the experimental condition, and then after being in the control condition. So let's just zoom in on the experimental and control condition to show you the assignment of these participants. So the participants, once again, let's say that we have participants showing up to our experiment. So we got 6 participants this time. In the repeated measures design, it's so called because you will repeatedly measure these subjects over here. So you will put all of them into the experimental condition, and they all experience the experimental condition, and their behavior gets measured in the experimental condition. And then you would put all of them into the control condition, and they all experience the control condition, and they all get measured in the control condition. So that's the overall layout of where your subjects go. So you would measure them once in the experimental condition, and then you would measure them a second time in the control condition. And one thing that's done in repeated measures designs is that the order that they experience these two conditions is typically randomized. So half of the subjects get experimental first, followed by control. Half of the subjects get control first, followed by experimental. And that's another example of controlling other variables, because you don't want the order to be a potential cause of any differences in behavior. All right, so any questions about the independent and repeated measures design so far? All right. So what are some of the advantages, disadvantages of these two designs? So the advantage of, one advantage of the independent groups design is that there are no order effects. So half of your subjects go to do one part of the experiment, half of your subjects go to do the other part of the experiment. There's no order effects because they're only experiencing one aspect, one level of that independent variable. So you do not have to worry about order effects. On the downside for repeated measures, you need to control for order effects. So as I just mentioned, you would not want to have everybody do the experimental group first and then do the control condition afterwards. You would want to make sure that you randomize the order of those two so that half of the subjects were in the experimental condition first and then the control condition. Half of the subjects were in the control condition first and then the experimental condition. And notice that this is not something you got to worry about with the independent groups design, because there's an order to the conditions here, but there is no order to the conditions here because you're either in the control group or in the experimental group. So you don't got to worry about order effects. You don't have to worry about things like people getting tired. You don't have to worry about things like people experiencing the control condition first and then figuring out what they're supposed to do in the experimental condition. There's no order effects for a independent groups design. All right, so that's one of the first advantages. The other advantage, it's related to order effects, is no carryover effects. Right? There's no carryover effects to independent groups designs. There are carryover effects possible with an repeated measures design. So let's take a look at how that might happen. So let's say that we wanted to, we'll stick with the example of violence on TV. We wanted to study what's the effect of violence on TV on aggressive behavior. So if we do a repeated measures design and we show 6 subjects a very violent TV program and then measure their violent behavior, right? That would be the experimental condition. If we then said, all right, well, here's a nonviolent TV show to watch now, and they watch a nonviolent TV show, and then we measure their aggressive behavior again, what might happen is that the violence that they viewed in the experimental condition might carry over into their behavior in the control condition, right? Kind of like with Halloween upon us, some of you might indulge in some horror movies. Horror movies have massive carryover effects because whenever you watch a horror movie, every creak in your house exposes that carryover effect, right? There was, I think it was Dimitri Martin, he's a comedian, and he once said he wishes other movies worked like that. He wishes like after you watch a comedy film and you hear a creak in the house, you'd be like, whoa, that sounded hilarious, right? But it doesn't work. Horror movies have huge carryover effects. So maybe if they watched violent TV here and then showed violent behavior, and then watched non-violent TV, they might still show violent behavior. It might still carry over and affect the outcome of watching non-violent TV. And while you can mitigate that by having that randomized, it still has the possibility that participating in the first condition will change your behavior in the second condition. On the other hand, in an independent groups design, these people over here, these subjects over here, will never experience the nonviolent TV program. So there's no way that the nonviolent TV program can carry over its effects. This group down here will never experience the violent TV program. So once again, no chance that the violent TV will carry over and influence their behavior, no carryover effects in the independent groups design. All right, so those are the advantages of the independent groups design and the disadvantages of the dependent groups design. Any questions on those so far? All right, so far we've talked about the advantages for this and disadvantages of for repeated. What are the advantages for the repeated measures and the disadvantages for the independent groups design? So one of the big disadvantages for the independent groups design is that it requires many participants. And depending upon the design of your experiment, tons of participants. Whereas the repeated measures design requires much fewer participants. So if we take a look at our two experimental designs here, you will notice that I have 6 subjects in this condition, and I have 6 subjects in this condition. I had 6 in the experimental condition, and I had 6 in the control condition, and the total number of subjects that I needed for that was 6 subjects. And if I added a third condition, I would still only need 6 subjects to do my experiment. And if I added a fourth condition, I would still only need 6 subjects to do my experiment. So 6 subjects goes a long way in a repeated measures design. With an independent groups design, you can't do it with 6 subjects. So to get 6 in one condition and 6 in another condition, I needed 12 subjects total. And if I added another condition, I would need 18 subjects. And if I added a fourth condition, I would need 24 subjects. And really, 6 subjects in each condition is a really low number. You would probably want 20 subjects in each condition. In a repeated measures design, in order to do that, you need 20 subjects. In an independent groups design, for this one here, you need 40 subjects. So it quickly escalates, and it makes the actual doing of the experiment very, very difficult, very challenging, very resource intensive, because you have to recruit the subjects, you have to pay the subjects a lot of times, you need time to run all those subjects, so that is one of the disadvantages. The big one though, and the one that, one of the reasons I really like the repeated measures design, is that in the independent groups design, you cannot control for individual differences. Whereas in the repeated measures design, you can control for individual differences. So what does this mean? Well, sticking with the violence in TV example, it was suggested that maybe one of the differences between the two groups, maybe one of the differences that led to more violence in one group compared to another group, was that we had an exceptionally violent individual in one of the groups, right? Let's just say that we just ended up with this green individual here, and they're just one of those uber violent, horrific individuals that you read about in the news sometimes, all right? So they're massively violent. This violent individual is going to be compared to these individuals over here, some of which are going to be very nonviolent. So I realize I chose the colors for this wrong, but anyways, stick with me. So this incredibly violent individual here will affect the average for this group. Let's say that this individual is very passive. This very passive, nonviolent individual here will affect the average for this group. And it's going to skew your results, not because of your independent variable, but because of your individual subject characteristics. So we try to minimize these individual characteristics using randomization, and we try to minimize these individual characteristics by having a lot of subjects, because this one violent individual is really going to raise the bar when you only have 6 subjects in this group. If you had 100, then this one violent individual would get averaged out much more. But still, notice that we need now 100 subjects. We get back into that, very, very many subjects. So it would be great if we could have a very violent person in this category and a very violent person in this category. It would be great if we could have a very passive individual here and a very passive individual here, and that is built in to the design of the repeated measures experiment. Because in a repeated measures experiment, the people in the experimental group are the same as the people in the control group. So if we have an extremely violent individual, well, he is going to be an extremely violent individual in the experimental group, and he's going to be an extremely violent individual in the control group as well. Meaning that he's going to uptick the amount of violence in this group the same as he's going to uptick the amount of violence in this group. So his uber violence gets canceled out. He cancels out his own individual characteristics. He controls for, is the word that they use, his individual differences. And this very passive individual there is going to be very passive in the experimental group. It's going to be very passive in the control group. He is going to control for his own extreme passivity, and that is going to take out or factor out those individual differences. So if we had somebody who came in, well, these are children. If we had somebody that came in with a lack of sleep, they're going to have a lack of sleep in the experimental group. They're going to have a lack of sleep in the control group. If we had somebody come in and they just had a huge lunch, so they're feeling a little lethargic, they're going to be lethargic in the experimental group. They're going to be lethargic in the control group. If we have somebody who's afraid of the experimenter, right? These are children. They're going to be afraid of the experimenter in the experimental group. They're going to be afraid of the experimenter in the control group. So any individual differences that these subjects have, they're going to control for those or factor those out by the fact of they're going to be compared to themselves. So this repeated measures design is great because it allows you to detect very small differences between groups. It's a very precise kind of scalpel type experiment where you don't need a lot of subjects, partially because they run in every single condition, but also because any individual differences are factored out from the fact that both conditions contain the same people. So that being able to control for individual differences is one of the big reasons why the repeated measures design is basically used. If you can use it, you will basically go with the repeated measures design. All right, so a few more advantages, disadvantages that we have. For the independent groups design, first off, are there any questions on these advantages, disadvantages so far? Make sense? All right, Continuing on, other things. So in the independent groups design, you can investigate relatively permanent change. So you can investigate change that occurs either permanently, occurs over hours, occurs over days, or maintains itself over days. Whereas in the repeated measures design, you usually cannot research relatively permanent change because you cannot put that subject into a second experimental condition. If they've already changed and it's relatively permanent, we can't put them into a second experimental condition. So if you wanted to test, for example, different techniques for reducing anxiety, right? And you were testing different techniques for reducing anxiety, and you taught somebody, you wanted to test between breathing techniques and a counting technique, right? So breathing techniques, one of them is like slow your breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Counting techniques is, start at 20 and count backwards until you reach 0. And you want to know which one of those two is more effective. Well, learning is a relatively permanent change. So if you put somebody in the first group and you say, all right, I'm going to teach you these breathing techniques, and then you put them in a stressful situation and you say, use your breathing techniques, they will. However, they've learned that breathing technique. So then later when you tell them, use the numbers technique in the second condition, they're liable to use that breathing technique as well, right? They're liable to not be able to be measured again because of that relatively permanent change. So you wouldn't want to put them in the repeated measures, measure them twice. You would want to only measure them the one time. Independent groups designs, this is a big one here. You can investigate and research quasi-independent variables. And quasi-independent variables are variables that you can divide people on, but you cannot randomly assign. In a repeated measures variable, you cannot divide people because they're experiencing every single instance. So this is one of the big ones that kind of locks some research into quasi-independent variables. So questions of interest or variables of interest, quasi-independent variables of interest, include things like gender. So there's a lot of research that is done on sex differences, gender differences between males and females, and that is a quasi-independent variable because the experimenter cannot manipulate that variable. The experimenter can take a subject and say, all right, you're male, I'm going to put you in the male group. You're female, I'm going to put you in the female group, and then we're going to see if there's any differences between the groups, right? We can split them up into two different groups, where the males are measured for their behavior, the females are measured for their behavior, and that is that independent groups design. We cannot use a repeated measures because we can't take a subject and say, all right, we're going to flip a coin, and for the first part of the experiment, you're going to be a male. Poof, I've made you into a male. Please complete this survey. And then they complete the survey, and you say, all right, now we're going to do the second part of the experiment. You're going to be a female. Poof. Now you're a female. Please complete this survey. We can't, right? We can't randomly assign some of these quasi-independent variables. So things like gender, the experimenter cannot assign. Things like age, the experimenter cannot assign. Things like socioeconomic status, if you want to know the differences between people that come from high socioeconomic status, rich people, people that come from low socioeconomic status, poor people, we don't have the resources to assign that. We can't have somebody show up to the lab and say, all right, well, let me flip a coin. Oh, you're going to be in the high socioeconomic status group. So here's a check for $1 million. There you go. Go off into your group over there. And the next person comes in, you flip a coin, and you say, oh, sorry, you're in the low socioeconomic status group. So let me hack into your bank account. We'll just clear all that out. You are now worth 0. And you can go over there into that experimental room. We can't do that, right? We're interested in what is the effects of socioeconomic status on behavior, but we can't repeatedly measure people in different conditions because we can't manipulate it. In those instances, we have to use an independent groups design where we will ask somebody, what's your family income? And depending upon their answer, we'll say, okay, that places you in the high socioeconomic group. Okay, that places you in the low socioeconomic group. And then we can see if there's any differences between those two groups. All right, any final questions about the experimental designs, independent and repeated measures, or anything else we covered today? We're all good? All right. So that is what I wanted to cover for today. So be sure, if you can, any innovations, any suggestions, let me know. Use that link in the announcement for week 6. Do vote on week 5 if you haven't already. And start up on your method sections. They're only going to be about 2 pages long. You know where to get the supplemental information right now. Read up on what goes into the subject section, what goes into stimulus apparatus, what goes into the procedure. Take a look at the articles that you found for nice examples of how to phrase things. Make sure you paraphrase them so we're not plagiarizing. But other than that, we are done for today.